Why did Jesus retreat to deserted places? Why did he distance himself from the crowd at the most crucial moments of his journey? These questions, although simple, hold the key to one of the most enigmatic aspects of his spiritual life: the deep and mysterious contact with voices that seem to come from another dimension, a sphere where time does not rule and language surpasses human words. In the Gospels, we find recurring references to moments when Jesus went up the mountain to pray or withdrew alone. But these moments were not just contemplative breaks. They were true dives into altered states of consciousness, mystical experiences that put him in tune with invisible entities, sources of wisdom that guided each step of his mission. These voices did not arise by chance. They emerged in silence, in solitude, when all the distractions of the world dissipated. The desert, an archetypal symbol of emptiness, purification, and encounter with the divine, became the ideal stage for these communications. By isolating himself, Jesus created the necessary space to hear what could not be heard amidst the noise of the world. It was in absolute seclusion that the voice from above became clear. But who was speaking to him? Was it the Father directly? Were they messengers? Or were they elevated fragments of his own Christ consciousness, echoing as external voices for better human understanding? The canonical texts only give us glimpses of this dimension. However, the apocryphal Gospels, such as those of Thomas and Mary Magdalene and the Dead Sea Scrolls, offer bolder clues. They speak of a Jesus in communion with a multitude of spiritual intelligences, being instructed, warned, and often comforted by these invisible presences. These voices not only guided him, but also shaped his words, his parables, and his silences. The very phrase, "Those who have ears to hear, let them hear," seems to be a subtle invitation to listen to these invisible dimensions, these spiritual realities that cannot be captured by common senses. Throughout the centuries, Christian mystics have tried to describe similar experiences. Saint Teresa of Avila, Saint John of the Cross, and many others reported moments when a voice, sometimes as soft as a whisper, sometimes as powerful as thunder, spoke to their hearts, revealing profound truths, answers that were not in books or churches. These experiences of ecstasy, in which the soul is raptured to higher spheres of understanding, echo what Jesus repeatedly experienced. And they invite us to consider the possibility that these voices are accessible to all who truly seek. But what is spiritual ecstasy? It's not simply an intense emotion, but an altered state of perception, where the ego temporarily dissolves and consciousness expands beyond the limits of identity. When Jesus entered these states, he didn't become someone different, but revealed the fullness of who he had always been. The awakened Christ within his essence allowed him to access higher planes of reality, where spiritual entities, forces, and intelligences communicated without the barriers of logic or linear language. It was as if his mind tuned into a sacred frequency, a spiritual radio station where the voices of eternity were always broadcasting. It's significant to note that, in many of these moments, Jesus was in prayer, but not a prayer as a plea or automatic repetition. It was a prayer of listening, a state of profound surrender, where the goal was not to obtain something but simply to stand before the mystery with a bare heart. This form of silent prayer is also a practice present in Eastern traditions, such as Zen and Vedanta, suggesting that Jesus may have accessed, by intuition or through received teachings, meditation techniques that facilitated contact with spiritual realms. Prayer as a gateway, silence as the key. Interestingly, this contact with the voices was not constant or automatic. At various times, the Gospels report that Jesus wept, was anguished, felt alone. This indicates that, despite the high connection, there were also periods of apparent spiritual silence, of inner darkness. This silence, however, did not represent absence, but a more subtle form of presence. The voices did not always manifest to alleviate, but to strengthen. They came when it was necessary to remind him of the purpose, reveal the next step to him, or prepare him for greater challenges. It was a sacred dialogue, with its own rhythm, beyond the control of the rational mind. These spiritual entities that spoke with Jesus were not always the same. Some seemed to convey cosmic wisdom, others practical guidance, and others still comfort in times of pain. This leads us to consider that Jesus was in contact with a variety of spiritual intelligences, each with its specific function within the grand divine plan. Ancient mystics spoke of angelic hierarchies, beings of light, cosmic councils, and even collective consciousnesses that acted as guides. Whatever name we give them, the important thing is to recognize that there are indeed spiritual intelligences that communicate with those whose consciousness is awake and whose mission requires clarity beyond the human. It is within this context that we can begin to understand the figure of Jesus not only as a moral teacher, but as a spiritual initiator, someone who had traversed the veils of ordinary reality and established contact with higher dimensions of existence. These voices that guided him were not hallucinations, nor were they products of imagination. They were real manifestations, tangible in their impact, and recorded in the attitudes, words, and miracles that followed. Listening to these voices was not an isolated phenomenon, but an integral part of his journey, his preparation, and his surrender. What makes everything even more fascinating is realizing that these moments of ecstasy often occurred amidst chaos. It wasn't in luxurious temples, nor in public assemblies, but in the desert, on the mountain, in the middle of the night. This invites us to reflect on the place of silence in our own lives. How often do we seek answers in noise, in distractions, in external opinions, when true wisdom reveals itself in withdrawal? The example of Jesus shows us that spiritual ecstasy does not require perfect conditions, but inner willingness, and that the voices that spoke to him may be, silently, waiting to also speak to us. At the end of this first immersion, the question that resonates is not just, who was speaking with Jesus, Zrenya, but who is trying to speak with us now? Perhaps the same intelligences are still available, waiting for willing ears, for prepared hearts, for open consciences. Perhaps the real miracle is not hearing a voice from heaven, but learning to quiet down enough for it to be heard. And in this sacred silence, the same light that guided Jesus' steps may begin to illuminate ours. The voices that guided Jesus in states of ecstasy did not emerge in a spiritual vacuum. They came from an ancestral web of wisdom that spanned civilizations and millennia. The historical Christ, before becoming the symbol of a religion, was the convergence point of spiritual traditions that had been speaking to men long before his birth. Understanding these influences is essential to comprehend the depth and origin of the messages he received. Jesus was educated in a spiritually fertile world, surrounded by doctrines that blended Jewish mysticism, Egyptian symbolism, the discipline of the Essenes, and even the philosophy of India. His words, gestures, and silences bore traces of these sources, and the beings with whom he communicated seemed to share the same timeless lineage of wisdom. In the heart of the Judean desert, there lived a mystical community known as the Essenes. They were not part of the official Judaism nor the priestly elite of Jerusalem. They chose to live on the fringe, in silence, in contemplation, purifying themselves to receive revelations. They believed in the coming of a master of justice, someone who would restore the balance between heaven and earth. Their practices included fasting, meditation, sacred writing, and communication with the unseen. Jesus, according to many traditions, lived among them, learned their secrets, and absorbed their discipline. And it was the Essenes who preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls the evidence of a spirituality based on listening to the divine, on visions and states of consciousness where matter gave way to eternity. Further south on the banks of the Nile, Egypt preserved an ancient initiatory wisdom, safeguarded in the temples of Isis and the mysteries of Osiris. There, initiates underwent trials of silence, darkness, and renunciation, all to become vessels of light. The pharaoh, in his symbolic essence, was the one who had heard the voice of the gods and returned to guide men. This idea strongly echoes in Jesus, who, after his experiences of ecstasy, also descended from the mountain with a quiet authority, bringing revelations and performing miracles. In Egypt, the word was considered an act of creation. It was enough to name to manifest. Jesus, in healing with a command, in calming storms with a whisper, seemed to personify this principle, as if every voice he heard taught him the sacred power of the word. Even further away, in the vastness of the Indian subcontinent, masters were already speaking of Atman, of the unity between the divine and the human, of silence as a vehicle for wisdom. Texts such as the Upanishads, written centuries before the birth of Jesus, describe states of samadhi, of ecstatic union with the whole, where the individual hears not a personal voice, but the eternal sound, the primordial Om. Many scholars and mystics suggest that Jesus, in his undocumented years in the official scriptures, may have traveled to distant lands, connecting with wise men from India, learning meditation, breathing, and contemplation techniques that facilitated contact with higher planes. It would not be surprising if the voices he began to hear had echoes of Vedic philosophy, voices that spoke of unity, detachment, and the awakening of consciousness. These influences did not compete with each other. They intertwined. Jewish tradition provided the moral and prophetic foundation. Egypt offered symbolism and ritual. The Essenes brought the focus on inner purification. India contributed the dimension of the eternal spirit. Together they formed fertile ground where the tree of Christ could flourish, and each voice that Jesus heard seemed to carry elements from these roots. Some spoke with the firmness of the ancient prophets, others with the sweetness of the Oriental mantras, and still others with the mystery of the Egyptian initiates. In hearing these voices, Jesus was not merely receiving new messages, he was accessing a field of wisdom shared by all the great spiritual traditions of the world. The concept of the Word, or Logos, is a common thread among these traditions. In Egypt, it was the sound that creates. In India, it was the Om that sustains the universe. In Greece, it was the Logos that structures the cosmos's reason. And in the Gospel of John, we have, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." This statement is not only theological, it's vibrational. The Logos that spoke with Jesus in his moments of ecstasy was the voice of the very principle of creation, a living, intelligent frequency that revealed itself in the language of entities, angels, invisible masters. Hearing it was not an exclusive privilege, but an opening of the soul to a field that has always existed. The voice as a field of consciousness is a concept explored by modern mystics. It is not just about an audible sound, but about a presence that communicates through vibration, through intention, through resonance. These voices, when speaking with Jesus, did not necessarily form human sentences, but conveyed whole realities, understandings that went straight to the spirit. And Jesus, through his purity and surrender, was able to decode these realities into accessible words, into gestures of compassion, into eternal parables. He translated the invisible into living language. He was the channel through which the Logos flowed until it touched human hearts. Jesus' ecstasy, thus, was neither isolated nor random. It was a point of convergence. Each moment of contemplation, each voice heard, each message received had deep roots in ancient practices and wisdom. Nothing was new, but everything was renewed. The entities with whom he conversed knew the old ways, guided with serene authority, reminded him of his mission, strengthened his connection with the Father. And at the same time, they challenged him to go beyond, to be a bridge between worlds, to teach not as one who merely repeats, but as one who embodies the truth. These spiritual traditions shared the idea that the visible and invisible worlds are interconnected, that there are beings, voices, and intelligences in other spheres, always available to the pure of heart, to the sincere seekers. Jesus was one of these seekers. His birth did not seal his enlightenment. He walked a path, was initiated, underwent trials, learned to listen deeply. And throughout his journey, these voices became constant allies. They did not replace his will, but broadened his vision. They did not dominate him, but awakened him. They were part of the same divine consciousness that inhabited him. To understand the totality of these experiences, one must abandon the linear view of history. It's not about a chronology of events, but a living tapestry of spiritual experiences woven over thousands of years. Each culture, each tradition, each teaching prepared the ground so that one day a man, born in Bethlehem, could hear the voices of eternity and transmit their essence with love, clarity, and power. That man was Jesus, and the voices that guided him still resonate, waiting for those willing to listen with an awakened heart. His silences contained echoes from the East. His parables revealed the symbolism of ancient mysteries. His miracles bore the vibrational signature of the initiates of the Nile, and his connection with the unseen was the result of a path walked with humility, surrender, and discipline. By understanding these influences, we do not diminish Christ. On the contrary, we amplify his light, better understand his mission, and draw closer to his example. Because the same field of voices that spoke to him also calls us. And the more we understand the sources that shaped his listening, the more we can fine-tune ours to the whispers of eternity. The voices that spoke to Jesus during his states of ecstasy were not mere metaphors or poetic projections of human experience. For those who deeply investigate the oldest spiritual traditions and mystical accounts from various cultures, it becomes increasingly evident that these voices came from real entities, living consciousnesses, endowed with identity, purpose, and a specific mission in the plan of creation. These presences, often described as messengers of light, not only instructed but also energetically supported the most crucial moments of Christ's journey. Jesus was not just a passive receiver of these communications. He was an awakened channel, capable of decoding extremely high frequencies that manifested as voice, light, and direct inspiration. The Gnostic tradition, which flourished in the early centuries after Christ, provides a detailed description of these hierarchies of light. The Gnostics did not view the spiritual world as a uniform and homogeneous plane, but as a multidimensional vastness where various orders of beings resided and operated, each with its specific function in the cosmic web. They spoke of the aeons, direct emanations from the divine, and the archons, entities that could both assist and deceive seekers. Jesus, according to many of these texts, was the one who penetrated these dimensions with full consciousness, discerning between the voice of truth and the illusory echoes of fallen creation. The entities with whom he communicated were the Elohim, the archangels, the seraphim, and also higher intelligences, like the Logos and the heavenly Sophia. The Gospel of Thomas, one of the most enigmatic texts of early Christianity, reveals a Jesus who not only teaches, but shares secrets received in states of profound revelation. In his words, there are mentions of realities that cannot be told to everyone, because they are revelations received in moments of union with the divine, when the world disappears and the soul merges with the mystery. In these moments, Jesus heard voices calling him by name, revealing the nature of the kingdom, pointing to dimensions of reality that human senses cannot perceive. These entities were more than messengers. They were cooperators of the divine plan, beings whose existence intertwined with Christ's mission on earth. Among the names that frequently emerge in the Judeo-Christian mystical tradition, Metatron stands out, considered the celestial scribe, the one who records all actions and thoughts, but also the one who guides the human soul through the veils of creation to the divine throne. Metatron is described as an entity of indescribable light, whose name should not be spoken in vain. Some Kabbalists assert that Jesus received direct guidance from this entity, especially during the most delicate spiritual decision-making moments. Another important name is Sandalphon, Metatron's symbolic brother associated with music and prayer. According to ancient traditions, he was the one who lifted the sacred words to the heavens. Sandalphon's presence in Jesus' experiences could have been the bridge between the inner sound and the visible manifestation of healing, of the living word, of the incarnate verb. We also find the figure of Archangel Michael, warrior of light, defender of the righteous, and commander of the celestial forces against the hosts of darkness. In many mystical passages, Michael appears as a direct protector of souls on a sacred mission, accompanying masters on their most dangerous paths. In times when Jesus faced intense spiritual trials, such as in the desert, at Gethsemane, or on the cross, it is possible to consider that Michael was present, not as a symbolic figure, but as a real force of support and courage. The voice that encourages, strengthens, and uplifts the spirit may have been the direct expression of this luminous entity, whose mission is to ensure that light is not defeated by doubt or fear. Another deeply meaningful reference comes from the mystical text, Pistis Sophia, where a Jesus is revealed who, after his resurrection, spends 11 years teaching his disciples about the complex structures of the spiritual world. There he describes celestial regions, hierarchies, dwellings of light, and even spiritual traps. He speaks naturally of entities that aided him on his path, revealing a direct coexistence with high spiritual beings with whom he exchanged information, received power codes, and restored sacred memories. These voices did not arise abruptly. They were part of a cosmic concert, a divine network of intelligences working in communion with Christ so that light triumphed over matter. The Kabbalah itself, a mystical tradition of Judaism, describes these entities as participants in the tree of life, with each sephira representing a divine quality manifested through spiritual beings. Listening to these higher intelligences requires complete alignment with the divine will. Jesus, as a pure and fully aligned channel, was like a finely tuned harp, perfectly resonating with the vibrations of these spheres. The voices he heard could be reflections of these sephirot, living expressions of compassion, wisdom, strength, beauty, and divine sovereignty. Thus, it was not about religious hallucinations, but about tuning in to higher realities. It's interesting to note that Jesus never treated these voices as something to be idolized. He listened, discerned, absorbed, but never blindly submitted. This reveals his innate spiritual authority. He was not commanded by the entities, but collaborated with them. His mission was so high that the very entities of light came to him as brothers and companions, not as masters. This attitude teaches us that true spiritual listening is not passive, but active, conscious, imbued with responsibility. Jesus knew who he was speaking to, tested the spirits, as the scriptures recommend, and remained firm in the inner truth, even when the sky seemed to scream or fall silent. Various spiritual traditions report phenomena similar to what Jesus experienced. In the East, the rishis spoke with the devas in deep meditation. The prophets of the Old Testament heard the voice of the Lord in visions and dreams. Sufi masters report internal hearings that guide them with absolute precision. What sets Jesus apart is the clarity, depth, and purity of his listening. He not only heard, but understood. And more than understanding, he embodied the truth revealed by the voices. Therefore, his words carried weight, his actions transformed, his presence radiated an authority that came not from the world, but from above. The voices that spoke to Jesus in his moments of ecstasy did not disappear with his departure. They continue to speak with those who tread the path of truth, renunciation, and sincere listening. The entities of light have not departed but continue to vibrate at the highest frequencies, waiting for those who, like Christ, are willing to be silent, to purify the heart, and to open themselves to the invisible reality. Because the light does not shout, it whispers, and only those who quiet the noise of the world can hear the eternal call. These voices are not the property of a tradition, nor do they belong to a religion. They are manifestations of divine love in forms that human consciousness can understand. Jesus was the great example that it is possible to hear, discern, and act according to these voices. And more than that, he showed that this contact is not a privilege of God's, but a natural right of the awakened soul. Listening to the entities of light is reconnecting with the original essence. It's remembering who one is. It's finding again the path from which one was never truly separated. And for this, it is necessary to follow the example of Christ. Be silent, trust, listen, and obey the truth that comes from above. If the voices of light guided Jesus to revelation, understanding, and the fulfillment of his divine mission, there were also other presences that emerged in moments of greatest vulnerability, of profound silence, of extreme openness of the soul. These voices did not come to strengthen, but to confuse, mislead, and weaken. They inhabited the inner shadows, feeding doubts, fears, and hidden desires. They were no less real than the voices of light. They were other expressions of spiritual existence, forces that tested the firmness of the soul, challenged the purity of intention, and put the integrity of the mission to the test. Jesus not only heard the celestial whispers, he also faced the silent screams of darkness, and he did so with a clarity that few have understood over the centuries. The episode of temptation in the desert is perhaps the clearest account of this clash between light and shadow. 40 days without eating, alone, in the heat and dryness of the desert, Jesus enters an altered state of consciousness where the mind dissolves and the deep layers of the self come to the surface. There, The tempter appears. But who or what was this entity? Was it an external figure, like a malevolent spiritual presence? Or was it a symbolic manifestation of the non-integrated aspects of the human soul? The esoteric tradition points to both possibilities. The voices of the shadow can come from both outside and inside. They are consciousness, yes, but also mirrors of the unconscious, portals through which the ego tries to regain the control it is losing in the face of spiritual expansion. These voices did not speak in a crude or absurd manner. They came with logic, with subtle arguments, with alluring promises. They offered power, security, recognition. They proposed shortcuts to the fulfillment of the mission, ways to win without pain, without sacrifice. They said, "If you are the Son of God, turn these stones into bread." A direct provocation, but also an insinuation. Use your power for your own benefit. In other words, betray your essence. The second voice said, "Throw yourself from the top of the temple." An appeal to the ego, to the spectacle, to the miracle as a demonstration of status. The third was even more subtle. "I will give you all of this if you worship me." The dominion of the world in exchange for spiritual submission. The tempter knew the sensitive points. The voices knew where to touch. But Jesus did not respond with anger. He responded with firmness, with discernment, with clear awareness of who he was and what he had come to do. This episode reveals that ecstasy is not always sweet. It can expose wounds, open gaps, intensify internal conflicts. As the light grows, it casts a shadow, and this shadow needs to be seen, confronted, transmuted. Jesus did not run from the confrontation. He remained there, listening, resisting, choosing. This teaches us that even the most elevated among us undergo spiritual trials, and that hearing voices is not in itself a sign of elevation. The question is, where do these voices come from? What is their vibration? What is their intention? What effect do they have on our heart? Wisdom lies in discernment, and discernment requires inner silence, self-knowledge, and fidelity to the highest purpose. The Kabbalistic tradition speaks of the Sitra Achra, the other side, the world of shells, distortions, illusions. It is not evil as an absolute entity, but as a deviation from the center, as a force that acts where there is weakness or pride. The voices of the shadow arise where there are gaps, hunger, loneliness, doubt, vanity. Jesus, by fasting and withdrawing, exposed himself to this field, but he did so with purpose, not to be defeated, but to illuminate these inner regions, to show that it is possible to hear and not bow down, to perceive and not be deceived, to feel and still choose the light. His fast was not merely physical, it was a stripping away of everything that was not essential. And in this state of essentiality, the voices lost their power. But the spiritual battle is not confined to the desert. In the Garden of Gethsemane, another pivotal moment reveals the complexity of the inner voices. There, on the verge of being arrested, Jesus is deeply anguished. His soul was sorrowful unto death. He prays intensely, asks the Father to take away the cup, but at the same time surrenders, "Not my will, but yours be done." These words indicate the existence of an internal tension, a real conflict. He was not a spiritual robot immune to pain. He was a complete being who felt everything, fear, anguish, doubt, but who remained faithful to the true voice. The shadows were there, offering escape, denial, comfort. But the choice was another, to remain at the center, to fulfill the path, to be a channel of divine will until the end. These voices from the shadows can also be seen as indirect masters. They don't appear to destroy us, but to reveal what still needs to be healed, faced, overcome. They are challenges that purify, mirrors that show what still binds us. Jesus, in facing them, not only won, he integrated. He did not ignore or deny them. He looked at them, responded with truth, and continued his journey. This is spiritual mastery. The voices from the shadows do not cease because a battle is won. They return in different forms, testing whether the light is firmly established or merely lit. Therefore, vigilance was a constant practice in his journey. Watch and pray was not generic advice. It was a tool for spiritual survival. Eastern traditions also speak of these trials. In Buddhism, Mara tempts Buddha with visions and doubts before his enlightenment. In Hinduism, inner demons are confronted before union with the Supreme Self. Shamans, in consciousness-expanding rituals, encounter entities that test their courage and clarity. Jesus shared this same trajectory. He entered the invisible worlds, heard the sweetest and the darkest voices, and chose to listen only to those that resonated with the truth of his soul. This requires a type of strength that is not measured in muscles, but in fidelity to what is eternal. The voices of the shadow are cunning. They know our history, our fears, our secret ambitions. They know which words to use, which images to project. They don't come as grotesque monsters, but often with familiar faces, with spiritual discourses, with promises of peace. Therefore, discernment is the most sacred weapon. Jesus discerned. He felt, he listened, but he did not let himself be carried away. The light within him was stronger. And this light was not only his. It was the reflection of the source that dwelled within him, that spoke through him, that sustained him in moments when darkness seemed closer. This clash between light and shadow was not an isolated event, but a recurring cycle. With each new step, each new miracle, each new decision, opposing voices would arise. Voices that said, "It's not worth it. Who are you to do this? It will go wrong." And always, amidst the noise, the true voice emerged, clear, serene, firm as a lighthouse. This was the voice he chose to follow, not out of imposition, but by decision. Because he knew that it was there, in the faithful listening of this voice, where his mission, his strength, his truth rested. The story of Jesus, then, reveals to us that hearing voices is not a sign of madness or holiness, but of spiritual sensitivity. The true criterion is not whether there are voices, but where they come from and where they lead us. The voices of the shadow inflate us, confuse us, distance us from love. The voices of light pacify us, enlighten us, reconnect us with the center. Jesus heard both, and by choosing wisely, he showed that true spiritual victory is not to silence all voices, but to listen with discernment and act faithfully to the greater truth. The voices that spoke to Jesus, the spiritual beings that manifested in his moments of ecstasy, did not just leave subtle traces in the mystical memory of humanity. They left words. Words that were spoken in secret, whispered in caves, revealed on mountains, recorded on papyri, scrolls, and codices that time tried to bury. But these words, despite centuries of concealment, continue to resonate in the forgotten corners of history. They are not in the most widely read texts, nor in the official doctrines, but in the apocryphal Gospels, in the Gnostic manuscripts, in the fragments of oral tradition that escaped censorship and survived like glowing embers in the midst of darkness. These are the lost words, records of the spiritual messages that shaped the consciousness of Christ and reveal a hidden map for those who wish to hear, as he heard. The canonical texts of the Bible, as inspiring and essential as they may be, have gone through filters, selections, and interpretations throughout councils and historical interests. What was left out often was not excluded due to a lack of spiritual value, but because it challenged power structures, suggesting a direct relationship between humans and the divine without the need for institutional mediation. In these alternative texts, the Jesus that emerges is even more mysterious, more intimate, more cosmic. A master who spoke of worlds within the world, of invisible layers of reality, and who transmitted formulas, sacred names, power words that activated states of consciousness in his disciples. He didn't just heal with faith, he taught words that heal. He didn't just love, he revealed the secret sound behind love. The Gospel of Thomas is a fascinating example of this hidden record. Instead of telling a linear narrative of Jesus' life, it gathers 114 secret sayings, many of them incomprehensible to those who read them with a conditioned mind. Jesus says, "Whoever finds the interpretation of these words will not taste death." There is an invitation there to decipher, to delve beyond the literal. In another saying, he asserts, "When you make the two one, and the inside like the outside, and the high like the low, then you will enter the kingdom. These are initiatory formulas, condensed phrases with multiple levels of meaning. These words are not just language, they are spiritual technology, vibrational codes that mirror the voices he himself heard in his moments of union with the divine. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in Qumran, there are texts that reveal a deeply mystical and ritualistic spirituality. Among them, the hymns of thanksgiving describe heavenly visions, internal struggles against the forces of darkness, and invocations to higher entities. Although Jesus is not directly mentioned in these manuscripts, many scholars recognize in them the same spiritual atmosphere that surrounded his experience. The Essenes who wrote them seemed familiar with practices that favored the hearing of spiritual voices: fasting, ritual baths, prolonged silence, study of the stars. Amidst these texts, there is a language that transcends the material world and prepares the disciple to receive messages coming from higher realms. The lost words of Jesus might have been echoed or anticipated in these forgotten lines. The Pistis Sophia, another Gnostic text of immense value, presents Jesus instructing his disciples after the resurrection about the mysteries of the above. He describes celestial hierarchies, sacred names that open portals, and even verbal formulas that protect the spirit during its ascent. He teaches specific prayers, secret mantras, words that dissolve barriers between planes. There are passages where Jesus delivers long discourses that seem to have been dictated by superior intelligences. In these passages, the language is hyperdense, symbolic, full of repetitions and precise sound structures, as if each syllable were a key to consciousness. The words that appear there are not poetic inventions, they are transmissions, echoes of the voices he heard when he withdrew from the world and surrendered to the sacred silence of the Father. These secret messages also relate to specific practices. Ancient texts indicate that Jesus taught his disciples the importance of preparing the body and mind for the reception of the words. Fasting, vigil, silence, meditation, chants, and prayer were the channels through which listening was refined. Furthermore, he taught them to keep these words in their hearts, to repeat them with reverence, not to profane them with common use. Many of these instructions were transmitted only to closer disciples, in moments of spiritual intimacy, when the soul was receptive and the veils of illusion were lifted. It was a language from soul to soul, without noise, without display. The voice of light required purity to be understood. In the Kabbalistic tradition, we find the concept of Shema, the sacred listening. It's not just about hearing, but absorbing, vibrating, being transformed by the word heard. Jesus lived the Shema in its fullest form. The words he received were not merely information, they were transfigurations. Each new message made him see more, feel more, love more. He became another with each listening. The lost words that we seek today are not lost because they physically disappeared, but because they have been forgotten as a living practice. They remain accessible, but only reveal themselves to those willing to silence the inner world and become an empty space where the voice from above can echo. These words can also be hidden in passages from the official Gospels, camouflaged by inaccurate translations or dogmatic interpretations. When Jesus said, "The words I speak to you are spirit and life," he was pointing to a power that goes beyond morality or rhetoric. He spoke with the frequency of the Spirit. The words were loaded with creative energy, capable of dissolving illnesses, breaking mental barriers, calming external and internal storms. It was as if spiritual entities spoke through him, using his human voice as a pure instrument. He was the channel, the incarnate word, the living vibration of a higher dimension accessing the material world. In many texts, we find references to sacred names, words of power that activate elevated states of consciousness. Names such as Yeshua, Elohim, Adonai, Abba, Ruach, Shekinah, among others, are not just divine designations, but frequencies. When chanted or contemplated with reverence, they awaken spiritual resonances in the human heart. Jesus, upon hearing these words through the voices that guided him, recognized their origin in them. Each sacred name was like a mirror that reminded him of who he was, where he came from, what his mission was, and he passed them on to his disciples as precious pearls, trusting that one day At the right time, they too would become seeds of light in awakened hearts. These lost words also have a collective dimension. They were not intended for isolated individuals alone, but for all of humanity, which, upon rediscovering them, could reverse its fall into unconsciousness. Each sentence, each symbol, each sound received by Jesus and carefully transmitted was like a genetic code of the soul, capable of restoring the connection with the divine. Throughout the centuries, masters and seekers have tried to rediscover these codes, to recreate them, to reinterpret them. But only those who seek with humility and surrender can access the living source of these words, because they do not belong to the past. They are still being spoken right now on invisible planes, waiting for awakened ears. The rescue of these hidden messages is not an archaeological act, but a spiritual one. It's not a search for texts, but for vibrations. Reading the apocryphal Gospels is not enough. One must listen with the soul, decipher with the heart. The words that once guided Jesus still vibrate in the matrix of creation. They are encoded in silence, in love, in courage. They are written in the winds, in dreams, in moments of deep intuition. They continue to call us, like the breath of a forgotten memory. And each time a soul awakens to this call, another lost word comes back to life. The miracles of Jesus, often interpreted as supernatural phenomena, were, in essence, direct manifestations of absolute obedience to the invisible voice that guided him. Each healing, each transformation of nature, each suspension of known material laws was preceded by a contact, a deep and silent listening, a total surrender to the will flowing from subtler planes. Nothing was done out of vanity, for proof, or for spectacle. Jesus did not perform miracles for himself, but because he was a pure channel for a divine intelligence that spoke, guided, and commanded through his awakened consciousness. The miracles, therefore, were not magic, but the natural consequence of an absolute alignment between the man and the mystery that inhabited him. A mystery that spoke, not with human words, but with spiritual frequencies that Christ translated into acts. The Gospel of John is particularly clear in stating that Jesus did nothing by himself, but only what he saw and heard from the Father. This seeing and hearing were not common senses, but spiritual abilities refined by discipline, prayer, and inner silence. Jesus became a finely tuned instrument, a living antenna that picked up commands from other dimensions and translated them into gestures, words, touches, and breaths. When he told a paralytic, "Get up and walk," he was not simply expressing a wish, but obeying a sacred impulse that came from the creative source and found in him a clear channel free of noise. The miracle, then, was not a rupture of nature, but its expansion through the vibration of the Spirit. This ability to perform miracles did not come from a personal power, but from the fusion with an invisible will that acted through him. And this will communicate it as a voice, a silent, subtle voice that emerged in pauses, in glances, in moments when time seemed to stop. The touch on Jesus' robe by the sick woman was not just a physical gesture. There was mutual spiritual recognition there. Jesus realized that power had gone out from him, not because he had decided to do so, but because upon hearing the woman's silent plea, something greater moved through him. He was a channel, not the origin. He was a bridge, not the source. The voices guiding him did not only tell him what to do, but when, how, and with what intention. It was a perfect synchrony between the invisible and the visible. In healing accounts, we often see Jesus asking, "Do you believe I can do this?" Or, "Your faith has saved you." These questions are not rhetorical. They are invitations for the other to also align with the same frequency of listening. Faith in this context is not just belief, but vibrational openness, resonance with the higher will. When someone believed, they were, in fact, tuning in to the same voice that spoke with Jesus. And when two become one, as he said, reality bends, matter responds, the body reorganizes, life remakes itself, the miracle manifests. But it all starts with listening, with the perception that there is a loving and silent intelligence always calling us to cooperate with creation. In many passages before performing a miracle, Jesus would retreat, pray, sigh, and lift his eyes. These gestures were not formalities, but internal processes of connection. He was listening, waiting for the answer, tuning in. And when the voice came, clear and precise, he acted. It was not emotional impulse, nor a desire to please. It was loving obedience to a voice that spoke from a region where everything is already healed, complete, full. The miracle, therefore, was to bring this completeness into the now, to embody the invisible, to manifest what already is, but has not yet been recognized by the common gaze. Jesus saw what others did not see because he listened to what others did not hear. This practice of listening before acting is central to the mystical path. Many later masters recognized that true transformation only occurs when there is genuine listening. Francis of Assisi, John of the Cross, Hildegard of Bingen, all reported moments when an inner voice, gentle, firm, full of authority, led them to do what they otherwise would never dare. And the result was always an opening of reality, a breaking of boundaries, an unexpected manifestation of grace. The Christian tradition, however, ended up transforming these events into isolated miracles, denying their origin in listening and surrender. But Jesus, in his essence, was always listening, always waiting for the command, always positioning himself as a channel for what guided him from within. The episode of the multiplication of loaves is a profound example of this active listening. Faced with thousands of hungry people, Jesus does not panic nor propose human solutions. He simply takes the loaves, raises them to the sky, gives thanks, and distributes. In this gesture, there is a deep listening to abundance. He does not listen to scarcity, but to the universe's generosity. He hears the voice that says, "There is enough." And he acts based on this listening. The miracle, then, is the materialization of this inner certainty. The voices of light that accompanied him did not give him mathematical formulas, but spiritual perceptions, and each one of them contained the vibration of abundance, compassion, and divine order. In other situations, such as when he calms the storm at sea, Jesus doesn't shout, doesn't beg. He simply says, "Be still, be calm," and the wind obeys. This is not a supernatural gift, but spiritual authority born from communion with the creative principle. The same voice that created the universe is the one that speaks through him. And when this voice manifests, the physical world bows down because it recognizes its origin. The waves obey, not Jesus as a man, but the Spirit that speaks in him. And this reveals to us that the miracle is not an exception, but a return to the primary order. Where the listening is pure, the divine will manifest without resistance. Many scholars and modern mystics suggest that Jesus operated in expanded states of consciousness, where his perception went beyond time and space. This would explain his ability to see what would happen, to know what people were thinking, to heal from a distance. Under these conditions, the hearing of spiritual voices becomes even clearer. The mind quiets, the heart aligns, and the channel opens. Jesus, when entering this state, became one with the higher will, and therefore could act with absolute precision. His miracles were, therefore, signs of this communion, testimonies that it is possible to live in harmony with the invisible plan. The esoteric tradition also speaks of the use of specific words, sacred names, sounds that act as vibrational commands. In some Gnostic accounts, Jesus uses unknown expressions, as if he were activating hidden realities. These words do not have power in themselves, but because of the spiritual origin with which they are pronounced. When Jesus said them, he did so with full awareness, first listening to the order from above and then transmitting it with absolute fidelity. There was no room for doubt, for hesitation. The voice that guided him was the same one that created, and he put himself at its service with love and total surrender. The miracles were not merely punctual interventions, but pedagogical demonstrations. Jesus used them to reveal the nature of reality, to teach that everything is possible when you listen with the Spirit and act with faith. Each healing was a lesson, each multiplication a reminder, each resurrection a collective awakening. He wanted his disciples to also listen, to also become channels, to learn to silence the world, to listen to the invisible. Because he knew, the voice still speaks, the power still acts, the miracle is still possible, but only where there is true listening. This listening is not a privilege of saints, but a right of every soul. Jesus said, "My sheep hear my voice." Hearing this voice is returning to the center. It is allowing the superior will to flow without resistance. And when this happens, the impossible becomes real, because it's not us who do it. It's the light that acts through us. Jesus showed the way, and each of his miracles is an invitation to follow it, listening, trusting, obeying the invisible will that dwells in everything. Before there was any matter, there was sound. Before any word was spoken by human lips, a vibration already traversed the confines of the invisible. This vibration, silent to physical ears but audible to the awakened soul, is what the ancients called the Word, the primal logos, the original language of the Creator. Jesus not only understood this language, he embodied it. When he spoke, when he healed, when he prayed, he was modulating frequencies that transcended common language. He did not use words as symbols only, but as waves of creation. Each sound emitted by his voice was a bridge between the invisible planes and the material world. Each syllable, intoned with pure intention, carried the power to shape reality. The Word was with God, and the Word was God, and this Word became flesh. This understanding of sound as a creative essence was not new but ancestral. In Egypt, the goddess Maat represented the cosmic order expressed through harmony, truth, and sacred sound. In the Vedic texts of India, the universe is created by Om, the original vibration. In Kabbalah, the name of God, the sacred tetragrammaton, should not be pronounced lightly, as each letter represents a living force, a frequency that contributes to the construction of the world. Jesus, when pronouncing the sacred names, when invoking the Father, when drawing the attention of the crowds, or bringing life back to the body of a dead person, was not just speaking. He was vibrating reality with precision. He was modulating the invisible with the language of the eternal. Every miracle was preceded by words, and these words were resonances of the divine. But there was more. There were moments when Jesus fell completely silent, and yet something happened. Because God's language is not limited to audible sound. It is vibration, pure frequency, pure intention tuned into the center of creation. Jesus' silence was, often, more eloquent than speeches. He knew that the true sound does not depend on vocal cords but on vibrational coherence. When he looked, when he touched, when he was simply present, everything organized around him, because his own presence vibrated with the language of God. It was a living harmony, a resonance field where the higher order manifested effortlessly. Sacred geometry is one of the visible expressions of this language. All of nature adheres to precise patterns, proportions, spirals, numerical sequences that are not the result of chance, but of sound in motion. Sound generates shape, vibration creates structure. When a frequency is emitted onto a surface with loose particles, it organizes these particles into geometric patterns. This science, known as cymatics, shows that where there is sound, there is shape. Where there is sacred sound, there is ordered creation. Jesus intuitively understood this principle. When he healed, he did not merely restore health. He reorganized the vibrational structure of the person's body. He restored the divine geometry lost through illness, fear, and spiritual disconnection. In the esoteric tradition, it is believed that Jesus knew the secret names that hold creation together. Names that, when chanted with purity and right intention, realign the self with the whole. These names are not just words. They are resonance formulas, sound keys that open portals and re-establish the connection with the source. That's why he recommended prayer in a closed room, in silence. There, the soul could hear the sound of the divine within itself, rediscover the melody of the spirit that never ceased to sing. The voices that spoke to Jesus were, oftentimes, songs, not in the human musical sense, but vibrational intonations, hymns of light, sound currents coming from higher planes. The Gospel of John begins with the phrase, "In the beginning was the Word." This statement holds one of the greatest spiritual secrets in history. Before any form, there was vibration, and this vibration was not chaotic. It was ordered, conscious, loving. It was the sound of the Creator thinking, feeling, manifesting. Jesus became the incarnate Word because his consciousness was in perfect harmony with this primordial sound. He vibrated in unison with the divine heart. This harmony allowed the world around him to bend in his presence, not by domination, but by harmony. Wherever he went, chaos dissolved, illness retreated, death was confounded, because the sound of life spoke within him. The parables he told were not just stories, but vibrational vehicles. The chosen words, the rhythm of his speech, the silence between sentences, all were part of a broader melody. Even those who did not intellectually understand what he was saying left transformed, because his discourse did not only reach the intellect, but the vibrational field of people. He awakened memories, reorganized structures, dissolved resistances. Jesus' words were not meant to be merely understood, but absorbed as frequency seeds, and those who received them with a fertile heart flourished spiritually. In the account of the Transfiguration, when Jesus ascends the mountain with 3 disciples and is enveloped by an intense light, there is a voice that echoes from above. "This is my beloved Son. Hear him." This voice is not a metaphor. It's a sound that everyone there hears, marking a moment of full revelation. The light, the sound, and the presence of spiritual beings converge at that instant. The Transfiguration is the visible manifestation of divine language acting directly on matter. The voice from above is not that of a man, but from a higher dimension interacting with the physical plane. This event reveals how the sacred sound is part of the movement of spiritual revelation. Where there is true sound, there is manifestation of light. Jesus also chanted prayers in Aramaic, a language laden with vibrational connotations. The Lord's Prayer, for example, in its original form, has a sound structure that induces states of meditation and elevation. Each word carries an energy field. It is not just a moral prayer, but a vibrational code of reconnection. When teaching his disciples to pray, Jesus was not teaching them to ask, but to vibrate correctly. He was teaching them to tune in with the frequency of heaven, to harmonize their fields with the divine field. That's why he said, "Thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven." The will of the Most High manifests where there is listening and attunement. The spiritual voices that spoke to Jesus also used this vibrational language. Often they didn't say complete sentences, but power words, sounds without direct translation, harmonic sequences that produced instant understanding. Jesus listened with his heart and understood with his spirit. These voices were tuned into the frequency of creation. And each time they spoke, Jesus was reminded of the music that moves the universe, an eternal symphony, without beginning or end, in which all souls have a note to sing. What we hear today as noise, Jesus heard as a hidden melody. What we see as chaos, he saw as a poorly read score. God's language is in everything, but only those who quiet their inner noise are capable of hearing it. Jesus not only listened, he became this language, and by becoming one with the creative sound, he began to manifest with his simple presence the order, healing, beauty, and love that sustain all things. God's language is the sound of truth, and the truth, as he said, sets you free. At certain moments in Jesus' life, the boundary between the visible and invisible world simply vanished. Not as a metaphor, not as a belief, but as a concrete and overwhelming experience. In these instances, everything around him was transfigured. Matter seemed to yield to light, time bent to the eternal, the gravity of existence surrendered to the lightness of a greater presence. These moments of transcendence were not accidental. They were profound and deliberate openings, born from listening to voices that did not belong to this world, but spoke within it with the authority of those who had created it. Jesus not only had faith in a higher reality, he lived it, he accessed it, he revealed it, and this revelation was a fusion of ecstatic states with the purest consciousness of being. The Transfiguration on Mount Tabor is the most emblematic episode of this breaking of dimensional barriers. There, in the presence of Peter, James, and John, Jesus transforms before their eyes. His face shines like the sun, his clothes become as white as light, and 2 spiritual beings, identified as Moses and Elijah, appear at his side in dialogue. The scene is intense, almost incomprehensible to the rational mind. But it's not a myth. It's the symbolic account of a complete mystical experience in which Jesus reaches such a high frequency that he becomes visibly light. What the disciples see is not an illusion, but the true nature of Christ, stripped of the dense layers of flesh, revealing what he always was, divine consciousness in human form. These states were not continuous, but they were also not rare. Jesus accessed them at specific times as a result of deep prayer, fasting, surrender, and obedience to the voice that guided him. In several accounts of the Gospels, we see signs of these elevated states. When he walks on water, when he suddenly appears among the disciples after the resurrection, when his presence causes awe and reverence without him having said a word. He was able to alter the vibration of his body, to pass through the rigidity of matter, to be in more than one place at once. This was not supernatural, it was ultra-natural. It was the manifestation of what the soul is capable of when completely unified with the Source. In the Garden of Gethsemane, before his arrest, Jesus experiences an extreme moment of tension and pain. But even there, amidst the anguish, he accesses an even deeper transcendence. Total surrender. He says, "Father, not my will, but yours be done." This phrase is not resignation. It is fusion. It is the moment when human will dissolves into divine will. There, at the height of fragility, Jesus becomes invulnerable. Because transcendence does not only occur in glorious ecstasy, but also in full surrender. Heaven touches earth when the soul says yes to what is, without resistance, without ego, without fear. It is in this silent yes that the greatest miracle happens, the birth of the eternal being in the flesh. After the resurrection, the accounts about Jesus reveal a different presence. He appears and disappears. He goes through closed doors. He is not immediately recognized. His voice has a different tone. His gaze, a different depth. This indicates that the body that returns is not the same body as before. It is a glorified body, a transcended material form, the result of an irreversible vibrational elevation. This transformation is only possible for those who have already experienced numerous instances of merging with the divine. The voices that Jesus heard prepared him for this moment. Each listening, each surrender, each silent ecstasy trained him for this new birth, where the spirit fully manifests in form and the form bows before the spirit. Many mystics assert that Jesus accessed states of samadhi, a Sanskrit term for the highest degree of union with the all. In this state, there is no longer subject or object, only full, timeless, non-localized consciousness. In these moments, Jesus was no longer just Jesus. He was the eternal Christ, the living Logos, the I Am that precedes and transcends all individuality. And this consciousness was not for him alone. He shared it. When he said, "I will be with you every day," he was speaking of this vibrational presence, this reality that does not depend on body, time, space. He became, in these moments, part of the Christic field that sustains humanity, that constantly calls us back home. These experiences of transcendence are not exclusive to Jesus, but he is the living archetype of complete fulfillment. Other beings throughout history, such as Buddha, Krishna, Francis of Assisi, Teresa of Avila, also reported moments when they were overtaken by a light that dissolved them, by a love that absorbed them, by a peace that was not of this world. What distinguishes Jesus is the consistency, the depth, and the mission associated with these experiences. He did not lose himself in ecstasy. He returned, transformed, and brought this light back to those who were in darkness. His transcendence was not an escape from the world, but a redemption of the world. He made the invisible touch the visible, so that everyone would know that separation is merely an illusion. During his retreats in mountains and deserts, Jesus often experienced these expansions of consciousness. There, where human noise ceased, he heard the voices more clearly. There, where the body weakened, the spirit strengthened. The desert was more than a physical place. It was an inner state, a condition of total vulnerability that placed him before the eternal without intermediaries. In these states he received instructions, visions, confirmations. And these visions were not dreams, They were parallel realities, higher planes where the purpose became evident, where the truth became tangible. He returned from these encounters with enlightened eyes, with accurate words, with a touch that healed effortlessly. The Holy Spirit, which descended upon him at baptism, was not a literal dove, but a conscious energy field, a living presence that merged with his being. From that moment on, Jesus began to live permanently connected to this field. He had become a vehicle of a force that was not of this world, but this did not negate his humanity. It elevated it. Every gesture, every word, every silence was now an expression of this union. This was true transcendence, to live in the world without belonging to it, to act among men with eyes fixed on high, to speak with the mouth, but with the voice of the Spirit. Jesus also offered others the opportunity to experience this elevation. When he laid his hands on them, when he healed, when he forgave, he was awakening in others the memory of what they too were. He said, "You are God's," not as a metaphor, but as a forgotten truth. He saw in each one the seed of the divine, and with his presence, he made it germinate. The voices he heard said this, that we are all called to union, to elevation, to transcendence. That pain, death, limitation are merely stations on the path back to the Father's house, and that the journey involves listening, surrendering, and having the courage to let the old identity die so that the eternal being can be born. The moments of Jesus' transcendence were gateways. Each one left a trail in the fabric of time, a vibration available to anyone who wishes to touch it. When we remember these stories with an open heart, we can connect with this frequency. It's not about admiring from afar, but about participating. Heaven touched earth not only because of Jesus, but because of the space he created for this to be possible. He was a living temple, a bridge between worlds, a vortex of light that transformed everything around him. And by following his footsteps, by listening as he listened, by loving as he loved, we too become bridges. We too make heaven touch earth. We too become embodied light. The voices that spoke with Jesus did not fall silent with his departure. They were not concluded with the Gospels nor imprisoned in the past. They remain active, vibrating on subtle planes, waiting for awakened ears, ready hearts, mature consciences. The same intelligences that guided him through the deserts and prayerful nights remain intertwined with the fate of humanity. They still speak. They still instruct. They still whisper eternal truths in the margins of everyday life, but to hear them, it takes more than faith. It requires presence. It requires silence. It requires the willingness to strip away the ego and haste to dive into the inner temple where this voice has always been. Many today believe that the voices of the Spirit can only be heard by saints or exceptional mystical figures. This is one of the greatest spiritual misconceptions. The entities that guided Jesus did not choose him for status, but for openness. He was a pure channel because he had emptied himself. Christ was not born with divine hearing. He cultivated this listening. He trained it in silence, in surrender, in obedience, in submission. And this same path is available to everyone. The voices have not disappeared. They have just become imperceptible amidst the noise of modernity, mental dispersion, the idolatry of reason, and constant emotional agitation. But when the seeker becomes quiet, when the soul turns its eyes inward, the same vibration that guided Jesus begins to pulse. There are countless contemporary accounts of ordinary people who, in moments of intense silence or crisis, have heard a voice, not physical, but as clear as any. A phrase, a word, a presence that becomes sound. These voices are not creations of the mind, but legitimate contacts with higher levels of consciousness. Often they come as a sure intuition, other times as a vivid dream, and still others as a thought that doesn't seem to be our own, but carries a wisdom we didn't have. They can appear in moments of pain or in instances of deep meditation, but they always carry the same signature. They do not judge, they do not hurt, they do not pressure. They only guide, enlighten, pacify. The challenge of the modern world is that it trains us for distraction. We live addicted to stimuli, immersed in artificial voices, anxious for immediate responses. And the voices of the Spirit do not shout. They do not compete with the noise. They wait. They are like subtle waves that can only be perceived when the sea of the mind calms down. Therefore, masters of all ages have taught practices of withdrawal, not to escape the world, but to listen to what really matters. Meditation, silent prayer, contemplation of nature, fasting of words, all of these are paths to reconnect with the sacred. They are routes of return to the vibration that Jesus heard, which is still in the air, around us, within us. The spiritual technology to hear these voices remains accessible. It is in the mantras, in conscious breathing, in the sacred words of ancient texts, in contemplative arts. It is also in the loving silence of a present moment, in the deep gaze between two souls, in the birth of a child, in the sound of the wind among the trees. The Spirit speaks through everything, but we need sensitivity to recognize its language. We need to tune our being like an instrument. Jesus was tuned because he lived in coherence. His thoughts, emotions, words, and actions were aligned, and this coherence created a conducive field for the invisible to manifest clearly. Spiritual voices also speak to us through symbols, coincidences, subtle signs. How many times have we come across a phrase, a song, an image that seems to bring exactly the answer we needed? These are ways of communication from above, methods that divine intelligence finds to reach us when direct listening is not yet possible. But the more we cleanse ourselves of illusions, the more we cultivate humility and surrender, the more direct the communication becomes. And what was once intuition becomes clarity. What was once a sign becomes a conversation. What was once a sigh becomes direction. Jesus demonstrated that spiritual listening is not something magical, but deeply human. It's our forgotten heritage. By saying, "The kingdom of God is within you," he was pointing to the place from where these voices come. They are not outside, not on some distant plane, but at the core of our soul. And every time someone silences the ego, goes through pain, and chooses truth, another channel opens, another bridge is built, another frequency of light manifests on earth. The voices keep speaking, but the question is, are we listening? Modernity has tried to discredit the sacred within. It has attempted to convince us that only what can be measured, calculated, and reproduced is real. But spiritual experiences continue to flourish everywhere. People of all cultures, beliefs, and ages keep reporting encounters with presences of love, light, guidance. It's not a matter of religion, but of openness. The Spirit blows where it wants, and the same force that spoke with Jesus continues to blow. In quiet retreats, in healing ceremonies, in nights of despair, in solitary prayers, this presence manifests itself. And when it speaks, we recognize it, because it touches something that predates language. It reminds us of who we really are. Reactivating this listening is also an act of collective healing, because a soul that listens to the sacred becomes a channel for others to listen. The peace that emanates from someone connected to the Spirit transforms environments. The word that comes from a heart aligned with the divine has the power to heal, to inspire, to awaken. Jesus knew this. That's why he said that everything he did, we could also do, and even more. He was pointing to a future where many Christs would walk the earth, not as arrogant gods, but as servants of the light, as living channels of the unfailing will. The voices of the Spirit are not in a rush, but they are urgent, because the world, in its pain and confusion, needs awakened souls. It needs people who listen to what is beyond fear, judgment, separation. It needs people who hear love, wisdom, compassion, and then act on it. Jesus listened and acted. He heard and walked. He received and offered. He did not keep it for himself. He was a passage. And this is the invitation that the voices still make today. Be a passage, be a channel, be an echo of what is eternal. Deep down, we all know there's something more. We've all felt, even if for a moment, an unexplainable presence, a certainty without reason, a silence that speaks more than 1,000 words. This is the voice. It's there. It's gentle but firm, loving but demanding, silent but transformative. It doesn't ask for perfection, but truth. It doesn't demand religion, but surrender. It doesn't require sacrifice, but consistency. It just wants a space within us for it to say what needs to be said. And when we allow it, everything changes. Because after all, it's not us who listen to the voice. It's the voice that awakens in us the memory that we have always been, also a part of it. Christ is not a figure of the past. He is a living, active, present frequency. And the voices that once guided him did not come for one man alone, but for all of humanity. They came to teach, to guide, to remind. They are here. And perhaps, at this very moment, as these words are being read, something within you also hears. A sound without sound, a presence without form, a call without words. When this happens, do not ignore it. Be silent, breathe, and listen, because it may be the same voice that 2,000 years ago whispered to Jesus in the deserts, and that now whispers, with the same love and hope within you. Now that we have walked together through this journey of silence, revelation, and deep listening, there is something essential that needs to be said. The voices have never stopped speaking. And if you've made it this far, mind unfettered, it's because a part of you already hears them, even if subtly. Perhaps in dreams, perhaps as inexplicable intuitions, perhaps as that feeling that there is something greater guiding your steps, even on days when everything seems dark. And this perception, as fragile as it may seem, is the master key in your hands. With it, you no longer need to just remember, you can live. And now, I want to hear from you too. When was the moment in your life when you felt a spiritual voice spoke to you the most? Write it in the comments. Sharing your story is not just a way to express. It's a signal to the universe that you're ready to listen even more. Here, in our Mind Unfettered community, each word has power, and your comment could be the spark that ignites the listening in another soul. And if this journey has opened portals within you, if you've felt that there's much more to be unveiled beyond listening, then the next step awaits you right here on the screen. In the following video, we will dive into an even deeper mystery. The secret code of the Tree of Life. Unlock the hidden power of Kabbalah. There, you will discover how the secrets of the Tree of Life reveal the sacred map of the soul, and how each sphere of this ancient diagram activates a hidden power within you. You already have the key. Now, are you ready to open the doors? Click now, Mind Unfettered, and continue your journey towards the light that has always been within you.